Before we continue talking about a normal flora, let's talk about a human immune system. On one of our future lectures, we're going to talk about structure of immune system. But today, let's just stop on the first line. Immune system. Our immune system consists of 3 lines of defense. But as I said, today we're going to stop on the first line of defense, and it has a name. It's called non-specific surface defenses, which is the first line of our immune system. Non-specific surface defense line can be structural, mechanical, and biochemical. Example of structural part of the first line will be, for example, anatomy of the skin. You probably remember from anatomy class that skin is made of epithelial cells, few layers of epithelial cells, and you probably remember that those epithelial cells are very tight, very close to each other. So this way our skin protects us from the environment. Another example of structural part of the first line will be mucous membranes. They're also made of epithelial cells. They're not as thick as skin, for example, but mucous membranes are covered with the mucus. And mucus, it's a part of our biochemical part of the first line, because mucus contains a lot of enzymes which are harmful for pathogens. Another example of biochemical part of the first line will be dryness and saltiness of our skin. Not a lot of microorganisms can grow and multiply in that dry, salty environment. Another example biochemical part will be acidity in the stomach. Bile salts. Bile salts we can use as an example of natural antibiotic in our GI tract. And the last part of the first line will be mechanical part. As an example of mechanical part, we can use movement of our bowels, or we call it peristalsis, bowel movement. Flushing of the urine. When urine flows through the urinary tract, it mechanically removes microorganisms from the surfaces of the mucous membranes of urinary tract. And the last example will be mucociliary epithelial. You again probably remember from anatomy class that mucociliary epithelium lines upper respiratory tract of humans. It's called mucociliary epithelium because it has cilia on the surface, and those cilia are covered with mucus once again. When pathogens get trapped on the surface of that mucus, they will be moved by cilia towards openings of mouth or nose. And then what we're going to do? Then we're going to cough them out or sneeze them out. Alright, let's summarize all information about the first line of defense. The first line of defense is called non-specific surface defenses. It can be structural, mechanical, and biochemical. We continue talking about normal flora or normal microbiota, and on this slide you see the sites where normal biota can be found. So those are skin, mucous membranes of conjunctiva, of nasal cavity, mucous membranes of mouth, intestinal tract, vagina, and urethra. Once again, those are the only area where normal biota can be found. Let's start with the skin. Skin is the largest organ of human body. It has 2 functions. First is protection. It protects our internal organs and tissues from the environment. Second function, It helps to regulate body temperature. So, what are the limiting factors of our skin? Means factors that prevent growth of microorganisms on the surface of the skin. The first limiting factor will be dryness of our skin and saltiness of our skin. Not too many microorganisms can live, grow, and multiply in this type of environment. Remember, only halophiles, means salt lovers, can live and multiply on the surface of our skin. Second limiting factor. Please remember, fatty acids, perspiration, contain enzymes, and those enzymes are very harmful substrates for a lot of microorganisms. Now let's talk about how microorganisms adapt for living on our surface of the skin. A lot of microorganisms, a lot of bacteria can produce or form what we call adhesins. Adhesins, those are protein molecules that are located on microbial cell surface or on the surface of pili. Bacteria use adhesins to recognize surface receptors on the surface of our cells, and then they use them to attach to the surface of that surface receptor, means on the surface of the cell. And on this slide you see a picture of epithelial cells. Those are surface receptors on the top of each cell. And this is a picture of Escherichia coli bacterium that has adhesin. So using that adhesin, E. coli recognizes surface receptors on our cells and then attaches to that receptor, and then it's very difficult for our immune system to remove E. coli from that surface. So what kind of microorganisms can be found on the surface of our skin as a part of normal flora? First group you have to know, those are staphylococcal species. They are gram-positive cocci in clusters. Second characteristic you have to know, they are facultative anaerobes. Next, the highest numbers of staphylococcal species are actually found in the moist areas of our skin. For example, around our nose, mouth, under the arms, in the groin areas. From group of Staphylococcus species, you have to know Staphylococcus aureus and Staphylococcus epidermidis. What do we know about those two examples of Staphylococcus species? Staphylococcus epidermidis is not pathogen. It's just part of normal biota. Staph aureus is actually pathogenic. And please remember, not everybody has Staphylococcus aureus as a part of normal biota on the skin. Only what we call carriers. Only carriers have Staphylococcus aureus on the skin as a part of normal biota. And please remember, if they have a Staph aureus as a part of normal biota on the skin, they always have it in very small numbers. Next group of bacteria that can be found on the skin is diphtheroids. Diphtheroids. Please remember, all diphtheroids are gram-positive bacilli that form very specific arrangement. We call it Chinese writing. Chinese writing. What does it mean? Those gram-positive bacilli actually, as they divide and reproduce, they stick to each other in certain way and form the pattern that very similar to Chinese letters. And because that pattern looks like Chinese letters, that's why we say that all diphtheroids are gram-positive bacilli in Chinese writing. They usually live within hair follicles. As an example of diphtheroid that is part of our normal flora on the skin, you have to know Propionibacterium acne. Again, it is gram-positive bacillus that forms very specific arrangement. We call it Chinese writing. What else you have to know about Propionibacterium acne? It is actually an anaerobe. It uses secretions of sebaceous glands as a source of nutrients. And as an end product, it produces fatty acids. Those fatty acids can cause what we call acne on the skin of humans. Please remember, acne is not infection. It is an example of inflammatory disorder. The next group, fungi. From this group, you have to know Candida albicans. And we will talk about Candida albicans when we talk about biota of the mucous membranes. And finally, the last example of normal biota of the skin will be mites. Yes, we have mites as a part of normal biota on the skin. From this group, you have to know Demodex folliculorum. Demodex folliculorum. It is a mite that lives within hair follicles and within openings of sebaceous glands. And it's very well known as a pathogen sometimes because it can cause blepharitis. Blepharitis. It is an inflammation of eyelid margins. The next side of the normal flora will be mucous membranes of the eyes. Let's briefly stop on anatomy of the eyes. Conjunctiva. Conjunctiva is a mucous membrane that covers inner parts of eyelids and a part of our eye. And inflammation or infection of the conjunctiva is called conjunctivitis. This area over here is not covered with conjunctiva because this is our transparent window. Through this window we can see, and we call it cornea. Inflammation or infection of cornea is called keratitis. So what are the limiting factors of our eyes? Tears. Tears, first of all, mechanically remove microorganisms from the mucous membranes of the eyes. Plus, tears contain enzymes or lysozymes, which once again are harmful for a lot of pathogens of this area. What kind of organisms can be found on the eyes as a part of normal flora? Normal biota of the eyes is very similar to normal biota on the skin, but there are smaller numbers of microorganisms that living in this area. So those are basically Staphylococcus species and diphtheroids. Nasal cavities is the next site of normal biota. This area is very favorable for microorganisms to grow. Why? Because it's moist, it's warm environment. What are the limiting factors for the organisms? We already talked about mucociliary epithelial that lines upper respiratory tract. And please remember, when patients, for example, smoke and mucociliary epithelium gets damaged, those patients become prone to upper respiratory tract infections. We inhale more than 10,000 microorganisms every day, and it explains why upper respiratory tract gets infected more often than any other system of our body. So what kind of microorganisms can be found here in this area as a part of normal microbiota? Normal microbiota of nasal cavities is very similar to normal biota of the skin, plus Streptococcus species and Lactobacillus species from gastrointestinal tract. Mucous membranes of the mouth is the next site of normal flora. Another very nice environment for microorganisms to grow. Again, moist and warm environment. The limiting factors are movement. When we speak, when we chew, swallow, we mechanically remove microorganisms from the surfaces of the mouth. Saliva also mechanically removes microorganisms from the surfaces of the mucous membranes, plus it contains enzymes that are harmful for a lot of pathogens. Normal biota is presented by organisms that are similar to normal biota of the nose, and plus, please remember, there are a lot of Streptococcus species are living on the mucous membranes and surfaces of the teeth of our mouth. From this group, you have to know Streptococcus salivarius, Streptococcus mitis, and the Streptococcus mutans. Please remember, Streptococcus species are gram-positive, cocci, in chains. As an example of another part of normal biota will be Candida albicans, which is yeast. Well, we talked about Candida albicans. I told you it's a fungus, it's a yeast, and I also told you that it can cause yeast infection of mucous membranes of the mouth, especially in immunocompromised patients, in elderly patients, and very common for infants. It's called thrush. From the mouth, food and microorganisms move into the intestinal tract, and they pass through esophagus, stomach, and upper intestinal tract. Those areas are not very favorable for microorganisms to live. Why? Because acid of the stomach, not very nice environment, friendly environment for microorganisms to grow. Bile salts, I told you bile salts would be an example of natural antibiotic in our body. And then mechanical factors, bowel movements. When our intestinal tract moves, it mechanically removes microorganisms from the surfaces. On the other hand, the large intestine is an area with huge number of microorganisms living. Look at this. 1/3 of the dry weight of feces are microorganisms. So you can imagine how many microorganisms we excrete every day. Every day. Example of normal biota is listed here on this slide, and to make it easier for you to memorize, we divided those organisms into two main groups. The first group, those are anaerobes, and from this group you have to know bacteroids, Bifidobacterium species, and Clostridium species. The second group is called facultative anaerobes, and those are E. coli, Proteus species, Klebsiella species, and the Enterococcus species. Please remember, normal biota in our intestinal tract actually protects us from gastrointestinal infections. How do they do that? First, remember, they have ability to attach the surface receptors of our cells, and by covering those surface receptors, they keep pathogens away from us. A lot of them also have ability to produce Bacteriocins, those are substrates that are actually harmful for pathogens. They can kill pathogens. What else we know about them? We also know that bacteria from GI tract can communicate. Remember, we talked about genetic exchange. And I told you the reason why we prefer do not use antibacterial treatment when patients have GI tract infections, because bacteria can exchange information. And as soon as one bacterium from GI tract becomes resistant to antibiotic, then by performing genetic exchange, they become all resistant in short period of time. And what's going to happen to our patient next? Our patient becomes carrier of that pathogen. So they can perform genetic exchange, means they can communicate. The next part of normal biota, the next area or site of normal biota is vagina. It is a warm and moist environment, so that is a favorable part of this area for microorganisms, but there are not too many organisms living there. Why? Because there are limiting factors. First of all, lack of nutrients. There are not too much of nutrients there for microorganisms to grow. The second limiting factor will be low pH or acidic environment. Please remember that low pH actually is created by Lactobacillus species. And remember, in the beginning of this lecture, we talked about the fact that estrogen supports growth of Lactobacillus species in human vagina. So that's why the main organism, the main example of normal biota of vagina, of course, will be Lactobacillus species. Besides Lactobacillus species, what else can be found in this area? Candida albicans, the yeast, fungus. And remember, Candida albicans is opportunistic fungus or opportunistic microorganism. And when it's given opportunity, it actually can cause vaginal yeast infection. Besides Candida albicans and Lactobacillus species, sometimes in this area we're able to find Streptococcus species, Staphylococcus species, and sometimes some anaerobes. And the last area of normal biota will be urethra. Please remember, urinary tract is essentially sterile, and the only area where normal biota can be found in the urinary tract is the lowest 1/3 of urethra. So what are the limiting factors of this area for bacterial growth? Mechanical flushing of the urine. When urine moves through the urinary tract, it mechanically removes microorganisms from the surfaces of the mucous membranes. Second limiting factor, epithelium that lines urinary tract consists of epithelial cells that are very tight, very close to each other. And actually, because they're so close to each other, they become resistant to attachment of microorganisms. Normal biota of this area will be presented by Enterococcus species and Staph epidermidis. Alright, speaking about normal microbiota. Normal flora, is it harmful or helpful for humans? Louis Pasteur believed that normal microbiota is not only helpful, but it is essential to humans and animals. But his associate, Ilya Michnikov, took the opposite position. He believed that all microorganisms compete with humans for the chemicals and therefore they're harmful. So to find out the answer for this question, scientists performed a very simple experiment. They took animals after they were born and still sterile, placed those animals into sterile environment, fed them with this sterile food, and just observe those animals growing. So what did happen to them? Nothing bad. They were grown healthy, happy. There was only one problem. They had no immunity developed. So this simple experiment proved actually that normal biota is not essential for us. But of course, there are some points that some scientists believe that it can be harmful sometimes. For example, some scientists say that normal biota or microorganisms from normal biota use vitamins, but there's no proof that any organisms from normal biota can cause actually vitamin deficiency. Also, some scientists believe that some microorganisms from normal biota can actually produce some harmful chemicals as an end product of their metabolism. And those harmful end products might cause cancer in humans. But once again, there's no proof that certain organisms from normal biota actually cause certain specific cancer. But of course, there are a lot of beneficial effects. First of all, we already know that microorganisms from normal biota compete for the surface receptors on the cells. And by covering those surface receptors, normal biota prevents attachment of pathogen to those surfaces. A lot of organisms from normal biota create low pH, acidic environment, and once again, by doing that, they keep pathogens away from us, they protect us. Of course, they stimulate our immune system. Because we have normal biota present, our immune system is stimulated all the time and produces new antibodies. Also, they can provide supplemental vitamins. For example, some bacteria provide for us vitamin K, which is essential for blood clotting. Some microorganisms can provide vitamin B12 for us, and vitamin B12 is important for production of red blood cells and the normal functioning of the nervous system.